My name is Grace. At 43 years old, I never thought I'd be walking back through the front door of my childhood home. Not after everything that happened. But tonight, here I was, standing on the cracked sidewalk in front of the house that had once been the source of so much pain and frustration. My father's 70th birthday party was taking place inside, and I was going to confront him. It wasn't a question of whether I should, but whether I could. The last time I stood on this porch, I was 18 years old, a girl who had just left the safety of her family behind, armed only with dreams of independence and a heavy heart. I had no idea that the door would be locked, that my father would turn his back on me without a second glance. I had no idea that when I left that night, I'd be walking away from my entire family, my mother, my brother, and the life I thought was mine. It wasn't an easy decision to walk away, but I couldn't take it anymore. My father, Robert, had spent my entire life telling me what I wasn't. I wasn't good enough, I wasn't disciplined enough, and worst of all, I wasn't his version of perfect. Every report card, every school play, every track meet, it wasn't enough. He wanted me to be a lawyer, a doctor, someone with a title he could brag about at dinner parties. When I got into architecture, when I finally built a life for myself on my terms, he couldn't understand. He never could. I could still remember the coldness of his voice when I showed him the scholarship to Juilliard. It was the opportunity I had worked for, a chance to pursue my passion, to make my own way. And all he could say was, "I didn't raise you to chase dreams." The finality in his words echoed in my ears long after the conversation ended. He had closed the door to my future, and I had to walk away to open it again. That night, I left a letter. I thought it would be enough. I thought my father would understand, even if it took some time. But when I came back, hoping he might have softened, the door was locked. My suitcase was waiting for me outside, neatly packed, a note from my father on top. "You made your choice. Good luck." It wasn't just the abandonment that hurt. It was the story he told everyone else. The version of me that ran away, that I was angry, unstable, that I was a problem he couldn't fix. The world believed him. No one asked me what had happened. No one cared enough to find out. I was erased, disappeared without a trace, a shadow in my own life. But tonight, standing at the edge of the porch, I knew that the time for silence was over. My father's 70th birthday celebration wasn't just a gathering. It was the culmination of years of lies, years of him rewriting our story to fit his narrative. And I was finally ready to set the record straight. I wasn't the girl who ran away. I was the woman who built something. I took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling my lungs. It wasn't the house that had changed. It was me. I wasn't walking into the past anymore. I was walking into the future, and I wasn't going to let him control it. With one last look at the house I grew up in, I turned, walked down the porch steps, and made my way to the Hilton downtown, where my father's party awaited. It was time to bring the truth back to the table. As I entered the downtown Hilton, the marble floors beneath my feet felt colder than they should have. The warmth of the evening's event had nothing to do with the grandeur of the ballroom, with its sparkling chandeliers and the chatter of well-dressed guests. The air felt heavy with a quiet expectation, a tension that ran deeper than the laughter and clinking of glasses. There, standing at the center of it all, was my father, Robert Carter, the man I once called my dad, now being celebrated for 40 years of service in the local school district. It wasn't just his work that people were applauding. It was the legacy he had built, the perfect family image he had cultivated. He had always made sure to present himself as the perfect father, the man who had it all together. Every community event, every family dinner, he wore his success like a badge. At school board meetings, he'd beam with pride when he spoke about me, his golden daughter, the one who would one day bring him honor. He'd tell everyone how I was on track to go to Harvard, how I was destined for greatness. And I'd smile, nodding along, knowing deep down it was all a facade. But the truth was always there, buried beneath layers of praise and perfection. What no one knew, what he never let anyone see, was the man behind the image, the man who had driven me away with his constant expectations, his inability to accept anything less than perfection. For years, I had lived in the shadow of his demands, trying to carve out a life of my own while he dictated who I should be. The moment I stepped into the ballroom, it was as if I had become invisible again. I could feel the eyes of the room shift, moving from their polite applause to whispered curiosity as I stood at the threshold just outside the double doors. They were all so focused on my father, so caught up in the man he had carefully crafted himself to be. No one was expecting me, not even Robert. There was Jake, my older brother, standing next to my father, as always. He had never left town, never pushed the boundaries like I had. He was Robert's right hand, always following in his footsteps, always the obedient son. It wasn't that Jake didn't love me. It was that he had learned to accept the rules of the house and never question them. And in his quiet way, he had become a part of the machine that had kept me in my place. I caught his gaze for a moment, and he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and confusion. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge the distance between us that had grown wider with each passing year. My brother had always been the peacemaker, the one who stayed quiet, never rocking the boat. But tonight there was no avoiding the reality that I had come to reclaim my story. And whether he liked it or not, he was part of this story too. Then there was my mother, Ellen, standing just behind my father, her face expressionless. I had long stopped expecting any support from her. She had spent most of my life caught between Robert's demands and my own needs. She had been the silent observer, too passive to stand up to him, too afraid to speak her truth. She loved me, I knew that, but she had always been complicit in allowing my father's narrative to reign. The familiar tension tightened in my chest as I watched them. The perfect family, the one that Robert had built to protect his image, was about to be shattered by the truth I had kept hidden for far too long. I hadn't come to this party to ruin it. No, I wasn't here for revenge or theatrics. I was here to tell them the story they had never allowed me to share, to show them who I really was. The music shifted inside the ballroom, the soft jazz band playing an almost mocking tune. That was my cue. I slid the letter back into my coat, tightened my grip on the edges, and lifted my chin. Tonight, I wasn't walking into a celebration of his accomplishments. I was walking into a confrontation. I was done being invisible. It was time for Robert Carter's perfect world to finally come undone. I pushed open the double doors and stepped into the ballroom. The chatter that had once felt welcoming now seemed like a blur of background noise. People turned to look at me, their eyes flicking from Robert's startled face to my own, their expressions ranging from confusion to discomfort. The elegant laughter that had filled the room just moments ago ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there for a moment at the threshold of my father's world, and everything I had been running from for years crashed over me. I wasn't here to make a scene, not in the way people might have expected. But there was no turning back now. The years of silence, the years of living in the shadow of my father's lies, had finally built up to this moment. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was reclaiming my own story, the one he'd stolen from me. Robert's face twisted in shock, his attempt at maintaining composure falling apart. His hand still rested on Jake's shoulder, a habit that used to bring me comfort, but tonight it felt like a barrier. Jake's eyes darted nervously between us, his usual role as the peacemaker rendered useless in the face of what was about to unfold. I didn't look at my mother. I couldn't. The years of silence between us had grown too vast. She had always been caught between us, her love for me and her unwillingness to challenge Robert. For all the good intentions I used to believe she had, she never stood up for me, not when I needed her most. I took a deep breath and walked toward the center of the room. The spotlight shifted from my father, whose stunned expression had already begun to fade into anger, to me. I felt the weight of every gaze, but I refused to shrink back. I was standing in my truth now, and nothing could undo that. I reached the microphone. The The room was so still, you could hear the clink of glasses on tables. A momentary gasp echoed from somewhere in the back, but it was quickly swallowed by the silence. I felt a small pang of nervousness, but it was quickly overtaken by the sense of liberation that had been building in me for years. This was my moment. "Hi, I'm Grace Carter," I said, my voice steady. "I'm his daughter." I didn't need to say much more. I had rehearsed this in my mind 100 times, but what came out wasn't a speech. It was the truth. The truth he had worked so hard to bury, the truth I had carried with me for too long. My father has spent the last decade telling people I ran away, that I was angry, that I disappeared, and no one knew why. But the truth is, he never gave me a chance to explain. I left because I had to find my own way. I had to get away from his suffocating expectations. I was just a girl trying to breathe. The room was utterly still. No one moved, no one spoke. My father's face went white, the color draining from his cheeks. For a second, I thought I saw something close to regret flicker in his eyes, but it was gone before I could grasp it. I pulled out the letter I had written when I left home. I didn't want to keep this a secret anymore. My hand was steady as I unfolded the yellowed paper. The edges were frayed from years of being hidden, tucked away by my father, who never wanted anyone to read it. The letter was simple, no anger, no dramatic words, just a plea for space and understanding. "I love you, I need space, I'll be back Sunday." The words hung in the air like an anchor, grounding the moment in its raw simplicity. I looked around the room, making sure everyone heard every word. "Does this sound like someone who ran away in anger?" I asked. I let the silence settle, allowing the weight of my words to sink in. Robert's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He couldn't. He couldn't twist my words, couldn't erase what I had just revealed. The quiet murmurs began in the crowd, people exchanging glances, unsure of how to react. I could hear the faint clinking of silverware being set down. Then, a voice from the back broke the tension. "Is that why she vanished?" someone asked. Another voice followed. "I remember praying for her." My father shifted uncomfortably. His image, the one he had so carefully constructed over the years, was crumbling before his eyes. He stepped forward, his voice tight. "Emily, that's not the full story." I raised my hand to silence him. "Don't. You told that story for 10 years. This is mine." I didn't need him to explain, to justify, or to twist the truth. I had waited too long for my voice to be heard. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth he had buried in a dusty attic and replaced with lies. And tonight, I was digging it up. The room was now alive with whispers, the once hushed crowd growing louder with every passing second. I could feel the weight of the truth spreading like wildfire, igniting conversations and shattering the carefully constructed facade of my father's perfect life. The applause had long stopped, replaced by a growing unease that hung thick in the air. Robert, the man who had always been able to command any room with his charm, now stood there, frozen. His face was ashen, his lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. He had no words, only an expression that betrayed him more than any lie could. "Grace," he started, his voice shaky, but I wasn't listening anymore. The truth was out. I wasn't here to fight him or to debate. The truth had a power of its own, and now that it had been spoken, there was nothing he could do to take it back. I had stepped out from under the weight of the years he had spent manipulating the narrative. The silence I had lived with for so long no longer had a hold on me. I glanced around the room at the people who had spent years in his presence, believing everything he had told them about me. The school board members, his colleagues, even my old classmates, all of them had been fed the same version of events, the version where I was a rebellious, unstable child who had simply disappeared. It wasn't just that they had believed him, it was that they hadn't cared to ask. It was easier to accept the story that fit into the neat little box he had wrapped it in than to question the man who had always been the hero of the narrative. Then, like a slow, unraveling thread, I heard it. The first cracks in the family myth. Mrs. Blake, my father's longtime vice principal, stood up, her voice tentative but firm. "I always wondered why you shut down the theater department so suddenly," she said, her eyes narrowing at Robert. "You told us she had a breakdown, that she was dangerous. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. I looked at her, surprised, but she wasn't finished. More voices began to join in. One by one, my father's colleagues, people who had always trusted his word, started to speak up. Mr. Rowe, an old guidance counselor, leaned forward from his seat, adding, "You said she was dangerous. You said she wasn't stable. We just trusted you because you were the one who knew." The weight of their words settled over Robert, his confident posture beginning to falter. His attempts to salvage the moment, desperately smiling, trying to play off what was happening, only made it worse. No one was looking at him with admiration anymore. They weren't even looking at him like the respected principal they once thought he was. They were looking at him like a man whose lies were finally coming to light. The final blow came when one of the former school board members, a man I hadn't recognized in years, stood up and asked, "You made her disappear to protect your image, didn't you?" The question was simple, but it hit like a thunderclap. The room went completely silent, and I saw Robert flinch for the first time that night. His grip on the podium tightened, his knuckles going white. The empire he had spent decades building on control, manipulation, and silence was crumbling piece by piece. Robert's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, but there was none. People weren't afraid of him anymore. The truth had done what years of silence and fear couldn't. And in that moment, I realized something. All the years I had spent feeling small, invisible, like I had to live up to someone else's expectations, had been for nothing. I didn't need his approval. I had never needed his approval. His hands trembled as he stepped away from the microphone. He didn't apologize. There were no words of regret. He simply retreated, retreating back to the table, to his fortress of image and power. And the people who had once admired him followed, their backs turned to him, their faith in his reputation broken. I stood there for a moment, watching him shrink into the corner of the room, where even my mother refused to meet his eyes. She was silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. The years of complicity, of living in the shadows of Robert's truth, had taken their toll on her too. The room was a whirlwind of quiet murmurs and uneasy glances. It wasn't the confrontation I had expected. It wasn't a dramatic scene with yelling or accusations. It was quieter, more profound than I had imagined. The silence in the room was no longer oppressive. It was freeing. I didn't need to speak anymore. The truth had been laid bare, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen. I had fought for my own voice, and I had reclaimed it. I didn't need to fight for anyone's recognition anymore. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was worthy. I had already shown them who I was. As I turned to leave, I didn't look back. The silence that followed me out the door felt like liberation. I had come to this party not to tear my father down, but to finally take control of my own narrative. The man who had spent years rewriting my story would no longer have that power. The truth had taken back what was rightfully mine. And as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized that the silence that had once weighed on me was now a source of strength. The evening seemed to stretch out forever as I walked away from the ballroom, my heels clicking against the polished marble floors with every step. The energy in the room had shifted completely. No longer was my father the proud principal being celebrated for decades of service. Now he was just a man whose carefully crafted empire had crumbled in front of his eyes. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I had anticipated. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was a quiet storm, one that had been building for years, finally breaking through. As I stepped through the side door of the Hilton, the cool night air hit me like a wave. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. Outside, the world felt clear. The stars above seemed more vivid, the crispness of the evening air grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. The weight I had been carrying, of secrets, of lies, of years of trying to prove myself, was gone. I wasn't living under anyone else's shadow anymore. I had stepped into my own light. Mia found me outside a few minutes later. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood next to me, the hum of traffic in the distance, the soft murmur of the party muffled behind the hotel's thick walls. I could see that she wasn't sure what to say either. We had spent so many years apart, our connection broken by the lies and the distance that Robert had created between us. But tonight, Mia had come to me with the truth, the same truth I had been hiding for so long. Finally, Mia spoke, her voice gentle but full of admiration. "You were brave," she said, her words simple but heavy with meaning. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the ground. No, I wasn't brave, I was overdue. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for us both. I didn't need to be brave anymore. I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my voice, my story. I had given myself permission to stop living for someone else's narrative, and now I was free. As we stood there in silence, the cool breeze rustling the leaves on the trees nearby, I thought about everything I had been through to get here. The years of feeling invisible, of trying to live up to expectations that were never my own. I had spent so long believing that if I just achieved enough, worked hard enough, I would finally be seen. But what I had learned tonight, standing in front of my father and his world, was that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I didn't need their approval, their recognition, or their love. I had already given all of that to myself. We stayed outside for a little while longer, the party fading behind us as the night carried on. I knew I wasn't going back inside. I had already made my statement. The truth was out, and I didn't need to relive that moment any longer. The rest of the night wasn't about confrontation or resolution. It was about walking away from the past, from the lies, and from the family that had always kept me on the outside. Mia and I eventually walked to her car, the city lights illuminating our path. She didn't ask me where I was going, and I didn't tell her. It didn't matter anymore. The destination wasn't important. What mattered was that I had finally taken control of my life. I had done something for myself, something I had spent years too afraid to do. As we drove away, I thought about how the story of my life had always been about the people around me, their expectations, their judgments. But tonight, I had written my own ending. No longer a victim, no longer invisible, I was finally living my truth. The silence from my father, my mother, even my brother, those echoes no longer haunted me. I had taken it back. I had reclaimed the silence, turned it into strength, and walked away with it as my own. I didn't need to explain my actions. The truth was loud enough, and for the first time in years, I was at peace.